So far, we've looked at some of the basic concepts. We've talked a little bit, for example, about sociological imagination. What we did then was to turn it on sociology itself. Now let's consider the sociology of sociology. If you think about it, sociology talks about human society. So the sociology of sociology will look at those people who make up, if you will, the sociological community, those people who've made contributions. So let me talk about a few of them and identify the ways in which they contributed to them. The first, generally speaking, is a philosopher by the name of Auguste Comte, who is considered to have invented a sort of social physics, or what's commonly referred to as positivism. The idea behind it is that there would be laws that would apply to human behavior much like there were laws that would apply to science and nature. So, for example, famously a couple centuries earlier, we had experiments by Galileo demonstrating the nature of gravity and how it had certain properties. Comte was going so far as to suggest that we could make such inferences as well when talking about human behavior. Comte was in part motivated because he wanted to see that there was a way to find some sort of sense to a society where religion was no longer providing this. Now think about it. You're talking about roughly the 18th century, the so-called Age of Reason. So in Europe, and of course in its colonies in North America, you're starting to see a move away from religion playing a central role in the organizations of societies and the ascension of, if you will, civil government. Now, the idea behind civil government would be different than what you would end up seeing in Europe, because you had basically the royalty being the ones who would have the authority and they were unelected. So concurrent with the creation of the United States, you started to see in Europe as well the ascension of these sort of non-sectarian ways of organizing and functioning. Comte's work was translated by a researcher named Harriet Martineau. What makes her interesting, besides being the translator, is that you'd see her as the first feminist social scientists. One of the implications, therefore, of this was to challenge the idea that there was a simple view in sociology, especially a male or masculine view, that it really encompassed or totally included everything that needed to be said. This is a point that was later picked up upon into the 20th century. Now, after Martineau and Comte, although those two preceded the next three, it's the next three that are often cited as examples of, or the being closer to the true founders of sociology. First, of course, is Karl Marx, someone whose theories became so famous that his name became associated with Marxism, which itself was the basis for the development of communism. The idea was that Marx saw class structures and ways in which classes worked against one another. In the case of Marx, he wrote a series of papers in Germany at a time when German society was changing. There had been a point in time when property would be owned in such a way that the local people could end up using the property, hunting for game, gathering firewood. But as you saw the rise of a commercial society in Europe, that is a society that would be interested in buying and selling things, you saw a growing recognition of the need for property ownership. The upshot? It meant that those lands that the local populace would use would not be foreclosed to them, since those lands would be sold off to private owners, and private owners would not want people from the community coming in and taking the firewood or killing the animals on that land. From Marx's perspective, and he does his writing in the mid-19th century in London, he's starting to see that increasingly that there are these two classes, but that there is a gap growing between them, and that they are antagonistic to one another. Marx ends up seeing sociology from the perspective of power. So when he looks at the effects of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and in America, he starts to see that those that have power will work to consolidate their power. When you look at what goes on later in the 19th century, you start to see the ascension in at least the United States of the so-called robber barons, people who will end up consolidating power and using their greater power to greater advantage. So you would see people like the ones creating the intercontinental railroads or the oil companies working to consolidate their power, generally speaking, at the expense of the worker. One of the points that Marx wanted to make, and did make, was that you would have the worker as the one who would provide, through the worker's efforts, some sort of output. But that output would be separated from the worker. The worker would get money, but cumulatively the worker's output was worth more than just the money that the worker received. And in fact, you'd see that an employer would take advantage of the fact that you had many employees who wanted to work, to use that as a kind of competition to drive prices down. And yet the employers would still enjoy the profits of the efforts of the employees. So from Marx's perspective, the solution to this imbalance of power would be to erase property, that is, to erase the means by which individuals could consolidate power over one another. At least on paper, this is what communism was supposed to be like. When you start to see it apply in Russia, you start to see the belief that in a communist Russia, Soviet Union, that the state will exist only so long as is necessary to redistribute property so that everyone is the owner and yet no one is the owner of any specific property. As history has shown, that fell far short of what these individuals had aspired to. Let me stop here and I'll prepare another segment on the other two major sociologists, Max Weber and Emil Durkheim.